Mary Thompson had always believed that life treated her differently. As a black woman, it was impossible to escape the nagging feeling that, at times, people saw her through a different lens, one tainted by prejudice, stereotypes, or just plain indifference. As she steered her SUV into the local garage, she couldn't help but feel that uneasy familiarity creep in once more. The garage had a reputation for decent service, but Mary had had her fair share of experiences that left her questioning the sincerity behind the customer care. Today, however, she had no choice but to return. Her daughter was flying in from Atlanta, and the trip to the airport had to be flawless. The vehicle needed to be spotless, not just for her daughter, but because Mary wanted everything to be perfect, no detail overlooked. She parked her vehicle and stepped out, glancing around the lot. Her eyes landed on David Stone, the service manager. David was a tall, clean-cut white man in his 30s, with an air of professionalism that made him seem approachable yet distant. The way he looked at her that day, just a flicker of acknowledgement before returning to the clipboard in his hands, set off a quiet alarm in Mary's mind. Had she imagined it, or was there a subtle disinterest behind his brief glance? She shook off the thought. Today, it didn't matter. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," Mary greeted with a firm smile as she approached the counter. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. What can I do for you today?" His tone was polite, his expression neutral, almost too neutral. "I'm here for the routine maintenance, oil change, fluid top-offs. But I also need the car washed inside and out," Mary explained, her voice growing more insistent with the last request. She didn't want to leave any room for ambiguity today. "My daughter is flying in this afternoon, and I need to pick her up by 5. The car has to be clean, especially inside." David glanced at his clipboard, his brows furrowing just slightly, but his face remained unreadable. "Sure thing, Mrs. Thompson. We'll take care of the oil change, and I'll have the exterior washed for you as part of the complimentary service. You'll be all set by 4:30. Mary's heart skipped a beat. Exterior. What about the interior? She had been here before, and last time they had cleaned both the inside and the outside without her having to specify. Why was this different? "What about the interior?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady. She didn't want to come across as combative, but something in David's demeanor made her feel uneasy. Was he avoiding something, or was she overthinking it? "We'll get the exterior done." "No problem," David responded, but this time his voice seemed a little clipped, as if the conversation had already gone on too long. "It's complimentary, just like last time." "But last time, you cleaned the inside as well," Mary pressed, feeling a growing tension in her chest. She was trying to stay calm, but the situation seemed all too familiar. How many times had she been overlooked or dismissed, just because someone thought they could get away with giving her less than she deserved? David gave a brief nod, his tone now more formal. "I'll see what we can do, Mrs. Thompson. But the complimentary service typically includes the exterior wash only." That was it. That was the moment when Mary felt it, the unmistakable sting of dismissal. Was this because she was black? Because she wasn't worth the extra effort in David's eyes? The question simmered in her mind, her thoughts racing faster than she could organize them. She had been here before, this feeling of being devalued, made to feel as if she was asking for too much. But was she? "I just want to make sure it's clean," Mary said, her voice quieter but laced with frustration. "Inside and out." David met her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then scribbled something on his clipboard. "We'll see what we can do," he repeated, and with that, he turned away to another customer, signaling the end of the conversation. Mary stood there for a moment, unsure whether to walk away or demand more clarity. Should she have to ask for the same level of service others seemed to get without question? Was she being too sensitive, or was David subtly treating her differently because of who she was? The seed of doubt had been planted. As she handed her keys over and left the garage, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She replayed the exchange in her mind, noticing the way David's expression seemed to shift, the way he had moved on so quickly after she had spoken. Would a white customer have received the same ambiguous response? Would they have to wonder if their request for a simple car wash inside and out was too much to ask for? Or was she making something out of nothing, as people had often told her when she pointed out disparities in the past. Still, the urgency of the day kept her thoughts in check for the time being. She had to prepare for her daughter's arrival. The car was just one part of the day's preparations, and as long as everything else went according to plan, she could let this small incident slide, at least for now. But deep down, Mary couldn't help but wonder if she was about to be yet another example of a black woman who had to settle for less, all because the system was stacked against her. Whether it was an oil change, a car wash, or something far greater, the nagging thought remained: how often were her needs being quietly dismissed, brushed off as less important than those of others? As she left the garage that morning, Mary knew one thing for certain: if they didn't clean the interior, she wouldn't let it go. Not this time. Too many small slights added up to something much bigger, and this moment might be the one where she finally drew the line. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the garage as Mary Thompson made her way back to pick up her car. The hours leading up to this moment had been filled with anxious anticipation. She had completed all her other errands for the day, preparing for her daughter's arrival, but the unease from her earlier conversation with David still lingered in her mind. She walked into the garage with the same feeling she had left with earlier that morning, a subtle but gnawing sense of doubt. Would the car be as clean as she had asked? Would they have taken the extra effort to make sure the interior was spotless, just as they had done for others in the past? David Stone was standing by the service desk when Mary entered. He was speaking with another customer, but as soon as his eyes caught sight of her, his expression shifted slightly. Was it just her imagination, or did his smile seem a little less genuine than it had earlier? She couldn't be sure, but it didn't matter. She was here for her car, and there was no turning back now. Mrs. Thompson, David greeted her with that same professional politeness, though Mary thought she detected a hint of tension in his voice. "Your car is all set." He held out her keys, and Mary took them, her eyes searching his face for any indication of how the day had gone. Was this the moment she had been dreading? Would there be something wrong? Or had they finally understood that she expected nothing less than the same service given to any other customer? "Thanks, Mr. Stone," Mary replied, forcing a smile as she made her way outside to where her SUV was parked. The vehicle gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight, its exterior polished to a shine. From the outside it looked perfect, just as it had the last time she had come here. Relief washed over her for a brief moment. But then she reached the door. As she pulled the handle and swung it open, her breath caught in her throat. The interior hadn't been touched. The same dirt marks on the dashboard stared back at her, taunting her. The same crumbs that had collected in the corners of the seats were still there, as though mocking her for ever believing that her request had been taken seriously. It was as if the car had been deliberately ignored, as though they had decided that her need for cleanliness wasn't important enough to be acknowledged. Mary stood frozen for a moment, disbelief slowly giving way to a simmering anger. Was this some kind of joke? Had they really thought she wouldn't notice? Her fingers gripped the car door tightly as she took in the sight of the unclean interior, her mind racing with questions. How could this have happened again? Her earlier suspicions now roared to life in her chest, a rush of indignation flooding her veins. This wasn't just about a car wash anymore. This was about respect, about being heard, about being seen as a valued customer, not someone who could be dismissed or overlooked. With a deep breath, Mary turned on her heel and marched back into the garage. The click of her shoes on the concrete floor echoed through the service bay as she approached David, who was now speaking with another mechanic. Her frustration boiled over as she reached him. "David," Mary called, her voice sharp and unwavering. "We need to talk." David looked up from his clipboard, his brow furrowing slightly at the intensity in her tone. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, though his eyes already told her that he knew exactly what she was about to say. "Did you even look at the inside of my car before you gave me the keys?" Mary demanded, holding up the key fob in front of him as if it were evidence of his negligence. "Because it's just as dirty as it was when I brought it in this morning. You didn't clean it." David sighed, a long, drawn-out breath that only fueled Mary's growing anger. "Mrs. Thompson, as I explained earlier, The complimentary service includes an exterior wash. We don't typically do interior cleaning unless it's part of a larger detail package. But you cleaned the interior last time without me having to ask. Mary shot back, her voice rising. Why is it different now? Is it because I'm black? Because I don't see you treating your other customers like this? David's eyes widened slightly at the accusation, his composure faltering for a brief second. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, his expression hardening instead. Mrs. Thompson, I can assure you that race has nothing to do with it. We provide the same service to all our customers. That's not what it feels like to me, Mary snapped, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to keep her emotions in check. I've seen you go above and beyond for other people. You can't tell me you don't offer the same care for everyone. David's face grew more defensive now, his voice taking on a colder edge. I'm sorry you feel that way, but our policies are the same for everyone. If you'd like to pay for the interior cleaning, I can arrange that, but the complimentary service is what we've provided. Mary's heart pounded in her chest, her frustration reaching a boiling point. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She wasn't asking for anything more than what she believed was fair. But standing here, in front of David's dismissive demeanor, she couldn't help but feel like she was being told, in no uncertain terms, that she didn't matter as much as the other customers who walked through these doors. This isn't about money, Mary said, her voice trembling with emotion. It's about respect. I came in here this morning and asked you to clean the inside of my car. I shouldn't have to explain why it matters to me. I shouldn't have to feel like I'm asking for too much, or that I don't deserve the same level of service as everyone else. David stared at her for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. Mrs. Thompson, we've provided the service that was agreed upon. If you're not satisfied, I'm happy to escalate this to management. Mary could barely contain her outrage now. She felt humiliated, like she was being told to accept less, just like she had so many times before. Her mind flashed back to other moments when she had been told to be quiet, to accept what was given, to stop making waves. But this time she couldn't let it go. Not when it felt like yet another instance of being pushed aside. No, Mary said, her voice firm. I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to escalate it myself. I'll make sure people hear about how you treat your customers, especially black women who ask for nothing more than the service they deserve. Without waiting for a response, Mary turned and walked out of the garage, her head held high despite the lump forming in her throat. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let this injustice slide. Too many times, she had been made to feel small, unimportant, invisible. This time she would fight. As Mary stormed out of the garage, her mind was in turmoil. The frustration that had simmered throughout the day was now reaching a boiling point. She replayed her conversation with David over and over in her head, each time feeling the sting of being dismissed. It wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about her dignity. She took a deep breath and walked around the side of the building, trying to collect her thoughts. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that this wasn't just an issue of miscommunication. It wasn't just an oversight. Mary had been through enough situations like this to know when she was being brushed aside because of who she was. Too many times, she had felt the subtle weight of discrimination, a quiet but pervasive reminder that she didn't always belong in spaces where her white counterparts seemed to move effortlessly. Mary pulled out her phone and stared at the number for the customer service hotline. She hesitated for a moment, then closed her eyes, remembering her daughter's face. Her daughter, who was coming home after months away, deserved better. She deserved to be picked up in a car that wasn't coated in dust and debris. But more than that, Mary deserved to feel respected. Respected as a paying customer and as a human being. With renewed determination, she marched back toward the garage. She wouldn't be silenced this time. As she re-entered the building, David glanced up, his face immediately tightening. He had been in the middle of talking to one of the mechanics, but now he turned his full attention to Mary, his posture stiffening. Mrs. Thompson, what can I help you with? His voice carried a hint of weariness, as though he were already expecting a confrontation. Mary took a deep breath, calming the storm in her chest. "I've thought about this, David, and I can't just let it slide. I feel like I've been treated unfairly, and I don't believe this would have happened to another customer." David raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Thompson, as I've explained, the service we provided was standard. I'm sorry you feel that way, but—" "No, David. It's not just that I feel that way," Mary interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. "It's that you haven't addressed my concerns. This is the second time I've come here and had my request for an interior cleaning ignored. Last time, you did it without hesitation, but now, you're acting like it's an unreasonable request. And I can't help but wonder, would you have treated a white customer the same way?" David's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with frustration, but there was something else in his expression, something unreadable. "Mrs. Thompson, race has nothing to do with this. We provide the same service to every customer, regardless of who they are." "Then why wasn't my car cleaned inside?" Mary asked, her voice rising slightly. "If it wasn't about race, what was it? Did you just forget, or did you think it wasn't important?" David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, another voice cut in. "Excuse me, is everything okay here?" It was Mrs. Patel, the Indian woman Mary had seen earlier in the day. She had been sitting in the waiting area, reading a magazine, but now she approached with a concerned look on her face. Mary glanced at her, unsure of how much she had overheard. "I'm just trying to understand why my car wasn't cleaned the way I asked," Mary explained, her frustration still evident in her voice. Mrs. Patel looked between Mary and David, her brow furrowed in confusion. "They didn't clean the inside of my car either," she said, her voice soft but matter of fact. "I didn't think it was a big deal. I thought it was just part of their policy." Mary blinked, taken aback by the woman's calm demeanor. Her mind raced. If Mrs. Patel, a customer who wasn't black, had received the same service, did that mean Mary's anger had been misplaced? Or was there still something more beneath the surface? David seized the opportunity, his voice steady but firm. "As I mentioned earlier, Mrs. Thompson, our complimentary service includes only the exterior cleaning. The interior cleaning is part of a different package, which we offer at an additional cost." Mary felt the ground beneath her shift. Part of her anger dissipated, but a larger part of her still clung to the belief that something wasn't right. Maybe the policy was the same, but why had David been so dismissive from the start? Why had he acted as though her request wasn't worth considering? Was it just a misunderstanding, or was there something deeper at play? Mrs. Patel, sensing the tension in the air, offered a small smile. "I'm sure it's just a miscommunication," she said gently. "I've been coming to this garage for years and they've always treated me well." Mary hesitated. Was she overreacting? The doubt gnawed at her, but the memories of countless other slights and dismissals whispered that she had every right to feel the way she did. Still, something about Mrs. Patel's calm presence softened the sharp edges of her anger. She turned back to David. "If it really is just a misunderstanding, then I hope you can see why I was upset," she said, her voice quieter now. "All I wanted was to feel like my request was taken seriously. I didn't want to feel like I was being brushed aside." David's expression shifted slightly. For the first time, he seemed to register the weight of her words. "I understand, Mrs. Thompson," he said after a pause. "I'll make sure we do a better job of communicating next time. I'm sorry if you felt like your concerns weren't being heard." The next few days weighed heavily on Mary's mind. The incident at the garage gnawed at her, replaying in her thoughts during every quiet moment. She had left the garage with a sense of temporary resolution, but as time passed, she began to question whether she had truly done enough. Her instincts told her that this situation had been about more than just poor service. It had been about respect, about standing up for herself as a black woman in a society where her voice often felt ignored. The lingering doubt grew into anger, and the more she thought about it, the more Mary realized she couldn't let it go. Too many small slights had built up over the years, and this felt like the moment where she needed to take a stand. If David and the garage weren't willing to listen to her concerns and treat her fairly, maybe they would have to answer to someone else. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Mary sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open in front of her. After hours of searching for advice online, she had made up her mind she was going to take legal action. She had read countless stories of other Black women who had experienced similar treatment, who had been dismissed or treated as though their concerns were less important. Mary didn't want to be just another statistic. This time, she would fight back. She picked up her phone and dialed the number of a local attorney she had found online, specializing in civil rights and discrimination cases. After a brief consultation, the attorney agreed to meet with her later that week to discuss the potential case. Mary hung up the phone with a sense of determination and relief. This wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about justice. Later that week, at the lawyer's office, Mary sat across from her lawyer, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. She had explained the situation in detail, recounting every interaction with David at the garage and how she had been treated. The lawyer listened intently, nodding as Mary spoke. When Mary finished, the lawyer leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully against her notebook. "Mary, I understand why you're upset. Discrimination can often take on subtle forms, and it's possible that you were treated differently because of your race. However, we'll need to prove that this wasn't just a misunderstanding or miscommunication. We'll need evidence that this was racially motivated." Mary swallowed hard. She had anticipated this. Proving discrimination was never easy. It was one thing to feel the weight of prejudice, but another to convince a court of it. "We can start by looking into the garage's service records," the lawyer continued. "We'll need to see if there's a pattern of this kind of treatment toward other Black customers. Additionally, we'll need witnesses, other customers who might have seen what happened that day." Mary nodded, her mind racing. Mrs. Patel, she had been there that day. Although Mrs. Patel hadn't seemed to believe that race was a factor, perhaps she could still testify to what she had witnessed. "Do you think we have a case?" Mary asked, her voice steady but uncertain. The lawyer hesitated for a moment. "It's hard to say without more evidence, but I do think it's worth pursuing. Even if we don't win, raising this issue can bring attention to the way businesses treat their customers, especially customers of color. Sometimes it's about more than just winning the case. It's about making a statement." That was all Mary needed to hear. She left the lawyer's office with a sense of resolve. She wasn't going to let this go. She had come too far to back down now. Back at the garage, David receives the news. The following week, David Stone sat in his office, sorting through paperwork, when he received an unexpected call from his manager. David, his manager's voice was tense on the other end of the line. "We've received a letter from a lawyer representing Mary Thompson. She's threatening legal action, claiming that you discriminated against her when she brought her car in last week." David felt his stomach drop. Legal action? He had thought the situation with Mrs. Thompson had been resolved when she left the garage that afternoon. Sure, she had been upset, but he hadn't imagined it would escalate to this point. "I didn't discriminate against her," David responded, his voice defensive. "I explained the policy to her multiple times. She got the same service as every other customer. It wasn't about race." "Well, her lawyer doesn't seem to think so," his manager replied, frustration evident in his tone. "We need to get ahead of this. If this goes to court, it could damage our reputation, maybe even cost us more in legal fees than the entire incident was worth. We need to resolve this quickly." David rubbed his temples, trying to think. He had always prided himself on treating every customer the same, but in this case he couldn't deny that something had gone wrong. Maybe he hadn't handled Mary's concerns as well as he could have. Maybe he had been too dismissive. But that didn't mean he had discriminated against her. "What do you want me to do?" David asked, knowing that whatever happened next, this situation was far from over. For Mary, the decision to escalate the situation had not been an easy one. She had spent days debating whether or not to take legal action. But in the end, it wasn't just about her car, it was about her dignity. She knew that her experience at the garage had been a small example of a much larger issue. And if she didn't stand up for herself, who would? As the days passed, Mary's conviction only grew stronger. She had faced discrimination before, but this time was different. This time she was going to fight. She didn't know what the outcome would be, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel invisible again. The day of the hearing arrived much sooner than Mary had anticipated. Her nerves were taut, a mixture of anxiety and determination swirling inside her. She had spent sleepless nights replaying the events at the garage in her mind, questioning whether she had made the right decision. But every time doubt crept in, the memory of David's dismissive tone and the sting of feeling disrespected fueled her resolve. This wasn't just about her car anymore, it was about fighting for her dignity. As Mary stepped into the courthouse, she took a deep breath. Her lawyer walked beside her, offering quiet words of encouragement. The sterile, cold atmosphere of the courtroom only added to the weight pressing down on her. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore, it had become a deeply personal one. David Stone was already seated at the defendant's table, his face pale and tight with tension. He looked up as Mary entered, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the strain beneath his composed exterior. He didn't expect to be here, fighting over something he probably saw as a minor misunderstanding. But for Mary, this was much bigger. As the court was called to order, Judge Harris entered the room. The middle-aged, no-nonsense Latino judge scanned the room with a steely gaze that immediately commanded respect. He adjusted his glasses and settled into his seat, glancing down at the docket. Mrs. Mary Thompson versus Mr. David Stone, Judge Harris announced, his voice booming through the courtroom. This case alleges racial discrimination in the context of a business transaction. We will begin with opening statements. Mary's lawyer rose to her feet, her presence calm yet authoritative. Your Honor, this case is about more than a simple disagreement over a car wash. It's about a pattern of behavior that demonstrates a lack of respect and consideration for a Black woman, a paying customer, who was treated differently than others in similar circumstances. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. The tension in the room thickened, and Mary's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the moment where her voice would be heard. But as the lawyer continued, the tone of the case took a sharp turn. While it is difficult to prove direct racial discrimination, Mary's lawyer said, we believe the circumstances surrounding this case demonstrate enough evidence to suggest that race played a role in how Mrs. Thompson's concerns were handled, or rather, ignored. David's lawyer stood next, his voice carrying a note of indignation. Your Honor, this is a baseless accusation. Mr. Stone has managed this garage for years and he has treated every customer with equal respect. The suggestion that this incident is racially motivated is both unfounded and defamatory. The hook was set. The air in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation as the tension reached a fever pitch. Judge Harris raised his hand, signaling for silence, his expression unreadable. We will hear from both sides, the judge said calmly, though his words carried an edge, and we will determine whether this is indeed a case of discrimination or a simple misunderstanding that has spiraled out of control. The hook had been planted. The courtroom, and everyone in it, was about to unravel the truth, or at least their version of it. The courtroom was tense, every creak of the wooden benches and rustle of papers magnified by the silence that followed the judge's declaration. Mary sat stiffly in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, especially David's, but she refused to look at him. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. The first witness was called to the stand, Mrs. Patel. Mary's heart fluttered as she saw the woman she had encountered at the garage make her way forward. Mrs. Patel had been so calm, so understanding that day. Would she help Mary's case or unknowingly work against it? This was the moment of truth. The lawyer began with routine questions, asking Mrs. Patel to describe the service she had received on the same day as Mary. Mrs. Patel explained calmly that her car had also been washed on the exterior only, without an interior cleaning. She didn't seem bothered by it, which caused a ripple of doubt in Mary's chest. And did you feel that you were treated fairly? Mary's lawyer asked, her voice probing for anything that could cast doubt on the garage's practices. Mrs. Patel tilted her head thoughtfully. I suppose I didn't feel mistreated, she said slowly, but that doesn't mean that Mrs. Thompson wasn't. We experience things differently, and just because I wasn't upset doesn't mean she shouldn't have been. Mary's heart lifted slightly at the witness's empathy, but there was no denying that Mrs. Patel's testimony had been neutral at best. It hadn't hurt David's case, but it hadn't helped Mary's either. The lawyer tried a few more questions, but it became clear that Mrs. Patel was neither a detriment nor strong support for Mary's claim. When she stepped down from the stand, Mary felt both grateful for her neutrality and anxious that more evidence was needed. Next, David himself was called to the stand. Mary's stomach churned as he walked to the front of the room. He looked confident, too confident, she thought. As he took the oath, Mary couldn't help but wonder if this was a man who had learned to mask his indifference with a veneer of professionalism. David's lawyer wasted no time in establishing his character. He asked David about his years of managing the garage, the numerous customers he had served, and the fairness with which he claimed to treat everyone. "I've always prided myself on treating all my customers the same," David said, his voice steady. "It doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. Mrs. Thompson's car received the same level of service as any other." "Did you discriminate against Mrs. Thompson because she's black?" his lawyer asked directly, a question clearly meant to elicit a strong denial. "Absolutely not," David replied firmly. "Race had nothing to do with it. The service she received was standard for everyone." David's testimony seemed airtight, but Mary's lawyer wasn't done. When she stood to cross-examine him, her questions took on a more subtle tone, probing at the underlying attitudes that might have influenced his actions without him even realizing it. "Mr. Stone," she began, "when Mrs. Thompson asked you to clean the interior of her car, how did you respond?" David hesitated. "I told her we couldn't do it as part of the complimentary service. That's our policy." "But you didn't explain that clearly to her from the start, did you?" the lawyer pressed. "You didn't take the time to ensure she fully understood the difference between this service and what was done previously." I thought I made it clear," David said, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. "Mr. Stone, you've been in this business for a long time. Surely you know how important communication is in customer service. Why didn't you take an extra moment to clarify? Was it because you didn't feel it was necessary for someone like Mrs. Thompson to understand?" The courtroom held its breath as David fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't think it was an issue of race," David said finally. "I just didn't think it was a big deal." Mary's lawyer paused for effect before delivering the final blow. "Exactly, Mr. Stone. You didn't think it was a big deal. And that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't think Mrs. Thompson's request was important enough to warrant extra attention. You dismissed her concerns without truly listening, and that's why we're here today." David opened his mouth to respond, but the lawyer's words hung heavy in the air. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. After hours of testimonies, cross-examinations, and heated exchanges, the courtroom finally reached its moment of reckoning. Judge Harris sat in thoughtful silence for what felt like an eternity. He had listened to both sides with careful attention, his sharp eyes never missing a detail. Mary sat rigid in her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she awaited the verdict. David sat across from her, his face pale and drained of the confidence he had exuded earlier. Judge Harris cleared his throat, and all eyes turned to him. His gaze swept over the courtroom before he spoke. "This case, on the surface, may appear to be about a simple car wash," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "But upon closer examination, it's clear that we are dealing with much deeper issues of perception, communication, and the way we treat one another." He paused, his eyes locking onto David. "Mr. Stone, I do not believe you intended to discriminate against Mrs. Thompson. However, intention is not always the most important factor. What matters here is the impact of your actions and whether or not you made a genuine effort to address Mrs. Thompson's concerns." David's face tightened, but he said nothing. "Your failure to communicate effectively and your dismissive attitude, whether conscious or not, contributed to Mrs. Thompson feeling devalued," Judge Harris continued. "In situations like this, it is critical to recognize the importance of empathy and understanding. When a customer feels unheard, it is the responsibility of the business to bridge that gap, not to exacerbate it." Judge Harris turned his gaze to Mary, his expression softening slightly. Mrs. Thompson, your frustration is understandable, and your determination to stand up for yourself is commendable. However, I do not believe that this incident was driven by outright racial bias. That said, it is clear that you were not treated with the respect and attention you deserved." He leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on a finality that sent a chill through the courtroom. "In light of the evidence presented, I find that while this case does not meet the threshold for racial discrimination, there was a clear lack of professionalism and respect in how Mrs. Thompson's concerns were handled. Therefore, I am ordering Mr. Stone and the garage to compensate Mrs. Thompson for the poor service provided." Mary's heart swelled with a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and yet a lingering sense of disappointment. She had hoped for more, but perhaps this was enough. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a step toward recognition. As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the case, Mary exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over. David sat quietly, his hands resting on the table in front of him, as though the weight of the judge's words had finally sunk in. For the first time, he seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened, not just the lawsuit, but the larger issue of how he had made someone feel. Outside the courtroom, Mary stood in the cool autumn air, watching the world go by. She had fought hard for this moment, and while it wasn't the resounding victory she had hoped for, it was still a win. She had stood up for herself, and that mattered more than anything. The lesson from this experience was clear. It wasn't just about race or about a car wash, it was about respect, dignity, and the small ways people can make each other feel invisible. For Mary, this case had been a chance to demand to be seen, to have her voice heard in a world that too often silenced people like her. As she walked away from the courthouse, Mary knew that the fight for equality was far from over. But today she had taken a step, and that step, however small, was a part of something much larger.